Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of the witnesses for joining us today. This is truly an opportunity, I think, for the committee to get a tremendous education with the aggregation of experience that you all have. I want to continue to pursue the discussion, maybe starting with Professor Taylor. I can truly identify with your notion, perhaps, that there's some moral hazard in abandoning a framework where riskier loans, countries like Greece were enabled to access the lending facility. But I hearken back, I was here when Secretary Paulson came and said, give us $700 billion, else the United States economy is gonna collapse. And my first reaction was not a very ladylike response. It was like blank no. And as I listened to experts such as yourself, I concluded that it just had to be done. And there was moral hazard. I think we're still experiencing it. I think we sort of bailed out the private sector more so than we did homeowners. And so I am wondering, so I guess my question to you, sir, and to Ms. Lutzinger, and perhaps Mr. Lowry would be, what do you make of the, quote, high risk of international spillover, the exception being the high risk of international spillover? I mean, do you honestly believe that if the IMF is not in a space like Greece or the Eurozone or other things, that there will be no impact on our economy here?
Well, what will happen in a situation like that is the IMF will say, your debt is unsustainable, with high probability. There is no exemption for a systemic spillover. So therefore, unless your debt is restructured, unless the private sector comes in and says, we're writing down or reprofiling that debt, you don't get a loan. So, but the result most likely will be is the private sector will get involved in that. And so that's really what, and having a clear rule in advance, a clear process in advance, that's basically what you hope will happen. I would add a few things based on my own experience. It is nearly impossible to determine about this systemic spillover risk. It therefore is very susceptible to political maneuvering and for people to claim there's this risk systemically spillover when nobody really knows. We discussed the difficulty of doing a sustainability analysis, what the likelihood is of the debt being sustainable. That does require numbers, but that is far easier than trying to determine the systemic risk.
Ms. Lutzinger, you have a comment?
Thank you. My fear is it's very difficult, first of all, for a particular country to determine insolvency versus illiquidity, but contagion, I think, is enough when you have the private sector jumping around. You see deposits leaving a country, leaving the banking system, which is very difficult because, as you know very well here in this committee, our banking systems are based on deposits not all being withdrawn at one time, and that this can then spread to other countries that have similar characteristics. We saw this in 2010. We saw more of this in 2011 in Europe, and you've all seen the market jitters right now as all this uncertainty about Greece remains in the market, and the brinksmanship going back and forth among the leaders in Europe. So yes, I was worried about contagion then, and I still think that's a main reason that we have the International Monetary Fund. Thank you.
Mr. Lowry, just very briefly, I think, at least you and Ms. Lutzinger have talked about the lack of leadership from the U.S. given its veto power and so forth in the IMF. If we don't sort of, adopt the framework, pay our dues, be the leader, what could ultimately be the impact? I'm thinking of the formation of BRICS, for example. Could you, any of you, sort of share with us what you think the consequences are of, a diminishing influence of the IMF and the rise of something like the BRICS?
It's a good question. I think that, look, my own view is that the United States should be taking a leading role. We helped form the IMF. We're the leading country in the IMF. If that means that we need to pursue some of the reforms that John Taylor's talking about, I think we should probably be looking at doing that. If it means to do some other reforms, we should be looking at doing that. But that does not mean we should be holding up going forward on an agreement that everybody in the world has agreed to years ago, that I think that most people in the United States, people that have sat in the executive branch, have actually think that this is a helpful institution for us to support. As to whether or not it means that the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the BRICS Bank is going to be created, and those are the reasons it got created, I can't answer that because I don't know the mindset of the Chinese. I do know this, that there is concern that the United States is not stepping up as an international leader in a number of areas that are not just about the IMF. And this is an area where I think that we can come to an agreement if we worked hard together.
Thank you. My time has expired.